Movie director Oliver Stone's latest work, JFK, has been the subject of much debate around the country. The premise of Mr. Stone's story is that the assassination of President John F. Kennedy was part of a government and military conspiracy. Earlier this week, Oliver Stone addressed members of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. He discussed the making of JFK and responded to criticism the film has received from some groups, including members of the Warren Commission. That commission originally investigated the assassination. We now present our coverage of Oliver Stone's speech.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I think I have George Lardner to thank for this turnout here today. Thank you, George, for coming. I have been accused by a number of people, some of them journalists, of a distortion of history. And if there is any common thread of attack running through claims of those critics of JFK, it is the notion that somehow there is an accepted, settled, respected, carefully thought out and researched body of history about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, all of which I have set out deliberately to subvert, using as my weapon the motion picture medium and taking as my target the impressionable young who will believe anything as long as it is visual. This distortion of history, quote, charge has come at me from all quarters, although almost entirely, it must be said, from people old enough to know better. And it ignores deliberately and carefully the fact that there is no accepted history of these events, and that terrible times remain the most undocumented, unresearched, unagreed upon, non-historical period of our history. One can read in history books the standard 2 paragraphs that John F. Kennedy was shot by a lone gunman, who in turn was killed by another earnest vigilante and lone gunman. End of story. But that theory, put forward in 26 unindexed volumes by the Warren Commission, from the day it was issued, was never even believed by a majority of Americans. And the number of people who disbelieve it increases each year. Are we really to believe that settled, agreed, sanctified history includes that Lee Harvey Oswald rode away under an easy-to-trace alias for an inaccurate mail-order Italian rifle called by the Italian army the, quote, humanitarian rifle, because it never killed anyone when deliberately aimed, when he could have anonymously bought an accurate weapon at any street corner in Dallas? Is it sacred history that this semi-literate high school dropout from Fort Worth, Texas, professing Marxism, was taken into a secret, highly trained Marine unit at an air base where the U-2 flights originated in Japan, given courses in the Russian language, and then permitted to leave the Marine Corps on 3 days' notice on a trumped-up claim of illness of his mother, who days after his death was the first to make the claim her son was working for American intelligence, who, by the way, may have something to do with these lights. Is it settled history that he then defected to the Soviet Union with a request for travel that included a reference to an obscure PhD's only graduate institute in Switzerland? Are we to believe it is now history, not to be disturbed except by people like me, that he then went to the United States Embassy in Moscow, announced his intention to defect and to turn over U.S. secrets to the Russians, and was permitted to go his way? Is it part of our history, which cannot be touched, that he then returned 18 months later to the same U.S. Embassy, announcing his intention to resume American citizenship, and was handed his passport and some funds to enable him to return home? Must one be a disturber of the peace to question the history that says he was met by a CIA front representative when he returned to the United States, that he was never debriefed by an intelligence organization, although 25,000 tourists that year were so debriefed? Must one be a distorter of history to question why he then merged into the fierce anti-communist white Russian community of Dallas, although he kept up the absurd front of Marxism, or the equally rabid anti-communist circle of Guy Bannister in New Orleans? Or how did Oswald just come to have the job a few weeks before at the book depository, overlooking the precise point in the motorcade where Kennedy's car took that unusual 11-mile-an-hour curve? Or how Oswald came to be spotted by Patrolman Marion Baker only 90 seconds after the sixth-floor shooting on the second floor, having a Coca-Cola and showing no signs of being out of breath? Or the too neat stashing of the rifle without prints, and the 3 cartridges neatly laid out side by side at the window? Or Oswald's cool and calm behavior that weekend, or his claim, his statement that he was a patsy? Am I a disturber of history to question why Allen Dulles, who was fired by JFK from the CIA, which JFK said he would splinter into 1,000 pieces, why was Mr. Dulles appointed to the Warren Commission to investigate Mr. Kennedy's murder? And so on, and so on, and so on. To accept this settled version of history, which must not be disturbed lest one call down the venom of leading journalists from around the country, one must also believe the truly absurd single bullet theory of the Warren Commission, which holds that one bullet caused 7 wounds in Kennedy and Connally, breaking 2 dense bones and coming out clean. No metal missing, no blood tissue, anything on it. Its path, as you know, utterly ludicrous, entering Kennedy's back on a downward trajectory, changing direction, exiting up through his throat, pausing for 1.6 seconds before deciding to attack Connally, then turning right, then left, then right again, hitting Connally at the back of his right armpit, heading downward through his chest, taking a right turn into Connally's wrist, shatters the radius bone and exits his wrist. The bullet launches one last assault, takes a dramatic U-turn and buries itself in Connally's left thigh. Later, the bullet turns up 5 miles from the scene of the crime on a stretcher in a corridor at Parkland Hospital in pristine condition. No, ladies and gentlemen, this is not history. This is myth. It is myth that a scant number of Americans have ever believed. It is a myth that has sustained a generation of journalists and historians who have refused to examine it, who have refused to question it, and above all, who close ranks to criticize and vilify those who do. So long as the attackers of that comforting lone gunman theory could be dismissed as kooks and cranks and the writers of obscure books that would not be published by, quote, reputable publishing houses, not much defense was needed. But now that myth is under attack by a well-financed and, I hope, well-made motion picture with all the vivid imagery and new energy the screen can convey. Now, either enormous amounts of evidence have to be marshaled in support of that myth, or else those in question must be attacked. Those who question it must be attacked. There is no evidence, so therefore the attack is on. Some journalists of the 60s are self-appointed keepers of the flame. They talk about our history and fight savagely those who would question it. But confronted with the crime of the century, with no motive and hardly any alleged perpetrators, they stand mute. Where in the last 20 years have we seen serious research from Tom Wicker, Dan Rather, Anthony Lewis, George Lardner, Ken Auchincloss into Lee Harvey Oswald movements in the months and years before November 22, 1963? Where have we seen any analysis of why Oswald, who many say adored Kennedy, alone among assassins in history, would not only deny his guilt, but claim he was a patsy? Can one imagine John Wilkes Booth leaping to the stage of Ford's Theater, turning to the audience and shouting, "I didn't kill anyone, I'm just a patsy"? One might ask of the journalists who have suddenly emerged as the defenders of history, what is their sense of history? How much work has the sage of Bethesda, George Will, done in the 20 years he has been a columnist to try to uncover the answers to some of the dark secrets in Dallas 63. Will Tom Wicker and Dan Rather spend their retirement years examining closely the possibility of a second or a third gunman, or will they content themselves with savaging those who do? Why is no one questioning Richard Helms, who lied to the Warren Commission when he said the CIA had no knowledge of Lee Harvey Oswald, when we know now that there was, as of 1960, an increasingly thick 201 file on Oswald? Or why is no one asking for the files of Operation Mongoose, which may be at the very heart of this conspiracy? Or why is no one questioning Mr. Hoover's memo of 1961 outlining the fact that someone was using Oswald's name while he was in Russia to buy trucks for the Guy Bannister apparatus in New Orleans? Why are none of the reporters questioning Colonel Fletcher Prouty in depth, or historian John Newman, or Marina Oswald Porter, who says her husband was working for something bigger, or question the hitman Charles Harrelson, who is in maximum security? Let them deny what they will, but at least ask them. There is more truth-seeking going on now in Russia than there is in our own country. What JFK has brought out is that those who talk the most of history have no commitment to it either. The central historical question raised by JFK, of course, has to do not with the tramps in Dealey Plaza, not with who might have been firing from the grassy knoll, not with what coalition of Cubans, exiles, mobsters, rogue intelligence officers the conspiracy might have been concocted by, but the darker stain on the American ground in the 60s and 70s, Vietnam. It is Vietnam which has become the bloody shirt of American politics, replacing slavery of 100 years before. Just as we did not resolve, if we ever did, the great battle over slavery until 100 years after the Civil War, when we passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so it becomes clear that the Vietnam War remains the watershed of our time. And the divisions in our country among our people opened up by it seem to gape wider and wider with each passing year. JFK suggests it was Vietnam that led to the assassination of John Kennedy, that he became too dangerous, too strong an advocate of changing the course of the Cold War, too clear a proponent of troop withdrawal for those who supported the idea of a war in Vietnam and later came to support the war itself. Was President Kennedy withdrawing from Vietnam? Had he indicated strongly his intention to do so? Had he committed himself firmly and against all hawkish advice to the contrary to oppose the entry of U.S. combat troops? The answer to these questions is unequivocally yes, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. has attested, and Major John Newman, a major work coming next month, when it is published, will surely contribute more heavily than any other volume of immediate military history to the solution of these questions. Major Newman makes it very clear President Kennedy signaled his intention to withdraw from Vietnam in a variety of ways and put it firmly on the record with the National Security Action Memorandum 263 in October of 1963. Those who try to say it was no more than a call for a rotation of troops or a gimmick, and that the Johnson NSAM 273 within a week of the assassination merely confirmed the policy, ignore the obvious question. If LBJ was merely continuing Kennedy's policies, why was it necessary to reverse the NSAM? So the protectors of Vietnam, the new wavers of the bloody shirt, leap to attack the central premise of JFK. Oliver Stone is distorting history again, they say, even suggesting that John Kennedy was positioning us for a withdrawal from Vietnam. By even suggesting that I am distorting history. But these defenders of history had very little to say 5 years ago when it was suggested in the motion picture that Mozart had not died peacefully, but had been murdered by a rival and second-rate composer. Where were all our cultural watchdogs when Peter Schaeffer was distorting history with Amadeus? The answer, of course, is that it wasn't worth the effort. 18th century Vienna, after all, is not 20th century Vietnam. If Mozart was murdered by Salieri, it would not change one note of that most precious music. But If John F. Kennedy were killed because he was determined to withdraw from and never send combat troops to Vietnam, then we must fix the blame for the only lost war in our history, for 56,000 American dead, and for an as yet unhealed split in our country and among our people. I have been ridiculed and worse for suggesting the existence of a conspiracy, as though only kooks and cranks and extremists suggest their existence. But this is the wrong city in which to ridicule people who believe in conspiracies. Is it inconceivable that a president of the United States could sit at the heart of a criminal conspiracy designed to cover up a crime? We know what happened. We would have impeached him for it had he not resigned. Just one jump ahead. Is it so far-fetched to believe in a high-level conspiracy involving the White House, the Joint Chiefs, the Air Force, and the CIA to bomb a neutral country and lie about it in military reports to the rest of the country? But it happened, perhaps more than once. Is it inconceivable that the National Security Council leadership, with or without the knowledge of the President of the United States and with the collaboration of the director of the CIA, not just a few rogues, could be engaged in a massive conspiracy to ship arms to our sworn enemy with a casual hope that a few hostages might be released as a result? But it happened. Does it offend our sense of propriety to suggest that an Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America might have regularly lied to Congress about raising money abroad to perform things that Congress had forbidden us to do? But that happened. Is it inconceivable that a campaign manager, later to become the CIA director, negotiated with a foreign country to keep American hostages imprisoned until after a presidential election in order to ensure the election of his candidate? We shall see. But I think no one thinks it is out of the question anymore. So when JFK suggests that a conspiracy involving elements of a government, people in the CIA, people in the FBI, perhaps people associated with the Joint Chiefs, all in the service of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about, might have conspired to kill John Fitzgerald Kennedy because he was going sharply to change the direction of American foreign policy, is it not appropriate at least to look there for evidence? What was Allen Dulles really up to in those months? Or Charles Cabell, also fired by JFK, or his brother Earl Cabell, the mayor of Dallas? Thomas Jefferson urged on us the notion that when truth can compete in a free marketplace of ideas, it will prevail. There is as yet no marketplace of history for the years of the Kennedy assassination and immediately afterward. Let us begin to create one. What I have tried to do with this movie is to open a stall in that marketplace of ideas and offer a version of what might have happened, as against the competing versions of what we know did not happen, and some other possible versions as well. I am happy to say, based not only on the 9 million people who have already seen the movie, but on the attitude towards the facts they take with them away from the movie, that our new stall in that marketplace of ideas is doing a very brisk business. And we expect by the time this film is played out in video cassettes, etc., that another 50 or so million Americans will have a little more information on their history. I am very proud that JFK has been a part of the momentum to open previously closed files in the matter of the assassination. Congressman Louis Stokes of Ohio, who chaired the House Select Committee on Assassinations, has announced his willingness to consider the opening of the files, closed until, as you know, the year 2029. And I am hopeful his consideration will ripen into approval. In addition, Judge William Webster, formerly the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and of the CIA, has indicated his strong opinion that all of the files, House, Committee, CIA, and FBI among them, be made public. A proposal I was extremely pleased last weekend to see endorsed by Senator Edward Kennedy. In the meantime, we are grateful to Congressman Stokes, Congressman Lee Hamilton, Judge Webster, Senator Kennedy, and others who have indicated a willingness to consider opening these files. Now, if the Army and Navy intelligence services will join suit, it is my hope the American people will have the full truth of this assassination. Thank you.
Should the audience take JFK at face value, or did you intend it to motivate people to re-examine history?
Well, I honestly don't answer. I don't understand this question. I think I've answered it in the above speech. These are one of these questions that are written before the speech, I suppose. Obviously, it's intended to make people think and to re-examine their history.
How in the world could the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, the anti-Castroites, pro-Castroites, all involved, have all been involved and someone not break by this time?
This has been I think, one of the central criticisms of the movie, and I don't think that people have really listened to what's in the movie, what the Donald Sutherland character who's playing X is saying. He says at one point that it's something that's in the wind, that there is a lot of disapproval of Kennedy. It is a conspiracy with no face. There is nothing on paper. There is plausible deniability. Only at the most secret point, the film cuts to one phone call is made from someone at a higher level to someone at a mid-range level. This person at the mid-range level then, according to X character, puts into motion a plot run by mechanics, people who do this kind of work. These mechanics, in a cellularized form, do not know who they are working for. They don't even know the name of the person who gives them the phone call to do so-and-so. They don't even know the name of the other person. These are the mechanics of terrorism, the mechanics of guerrilla warfare. It is conceivable to me that this thing could have been very small, very limited in scope, and pulled off, as were many coups d'etats in many different countries all over the world. America is no different than a Central American, South American, or an Asiatic or European country. Coups d'etats occur. One must study the history of coups. The larger issue is, I think what we point to in the movie is that there seems to be a silent consent to a cover-up, to a cover story, to a belief that Oswald did it alone. And under those conditions, we get into the concept of two conspiracies. One conspiracy to kill the president and another conspiracy to cover it up.
Does the Deep Throat character played by Sutherland exist? Was he a composite?
I'm very glad this is asked, because so many people have asked me when they come out of the movie, who is X? And I think that many of our critics and our enemies have used, let me just say that X exists. He's here today on the podium. It is primarily Fletcher Prouty who's sitting here. Fletcher served in the military since World War II, and in the 1960s he was in the Pentagon as one of the chief focal officers working with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a liaison with the CIA. He did provided a lot of the military hardware for CIA covert operations, black operations, and it was Mr. Prouty who came to me 2 years ago and told me his story of the Pentagon and Kennedy from 1961 to 1963, and his own shock and belief at what happened, at the events that happened in those years. I subsequently used some of the information given to me by John Newman based on his historical research into that period and information you will see in his book, JFK in Vietnam. So X is primarily Fletcher with an additional piece of information and substantiation given by John. X never met with Jim Garrison. He met with me. But I took the liberty of having the meeting occur between Mr. Garrison and X because Jim Garrison reached essentially the same conclusions in 1968 and 9 and wrote about them in his first book, Heritage of Stone. Mr. Garrison's conclusions were that the possible motive for Kennedy's slaying was the winding down of the Cold War. And for that reason, I think some people have misunderstood and claimed that X never existed and that I made him up. I never did. All this information comes from Fletcher Prouty and John Newman.
This questioner says, please speak to the credibility of Mr. Prouty.
I'm sorry, what is the question?
Please speak to the credibility of Mr. Prouty.
I think Mr. Prouty has served his country and retired as a full colonel. He's written a book called The Secret Team, which is available for you to read. He has been critical of the CIA's illegitimate activities in the 50s and the 60s. He knows a lot about it. He briefed people like Alan Dulles, knew them, knew Richard Bissell, Charles Cabell, knew the atmosphere in the Pentagon at the time, knew Ed Lansdale. He retired in 1964, I believe, from the Pentagon and became a banker, studied banking, international banking, and the mechanics of where the money goes, because as you know, the CIA has quite a bit of it, and is now in retirement in Virginia, and I would urge you to question him yourselves. He's available after this press conference to talk with you and ask him as many questions as you want. His activities in later years are his business as far as I'm concerned. I am concerned with the 1960 period and the 1950 period.
Why would sophisticated assassins allow Abraham Zapruder to film the shooting at that vantage point?
Well, I think there were other films taken. It wasn't just Zapruder. There was a film taken by Nix, and there was a film taken by the Babushka lady that has, since we have a picture of a woman photographing the assassination. She was at a very crucial point, too. So there were 3 or 4 people that were shooting films as well as still photographs. It wasn't in the assassin's interest to take a machine gun and assassinate everyone on the knoll. And if you stand behind the fence, you are blocked. Zapruder could not see you. It's a very there's some shrubbery there that blocked Zapruder's view of the fence shooter. In fact, when Zapruder panned around, and you can see it on the end of the Zapruder film, it is very difficult to see what's behind the fence, and no one has been able to. So I think they would have called a lot more attention to themselves by removing somebody like Zapruder, who came, by the way, probably at the last minute, as did a lot of these people.
Although the Zapruder film clearly makes the case for Kennedy being shot from the front, researcher David Lifton has suggested alterations were made in the film during its 3-day possession by the CIA to cover up other clues in the film. Did you or your cinematographer detect any tampering in your copy of the film?
I'm going to pass this on to my researcher, and maybe we should move on to the next question, and then, because I don't know about this issue about tampering with the film.
Why would the Warren Commission, composed of both supporters and opponents of Kennedy, be united in a cover-up?
Well, one must not forget the history that the Warren Commission was divided. that I believe it was Boggs, Cooper, and Russell. Is that correct? Boggs, Cooper, and Russell wanted to have a dissenting report filed, and it was promised to them, and it was never filed. And several of those people did not go along with the magic bullet theory. In fact, the people who looked at the Zapruder film in that room with Arlen Specter, we have a report document that says that Specter was the only one in the room that came up with this magic bullet idea. None of the other people in that room believed it. So somehow that became the final word. I think that Hale Boggs in later years expressed many reservations. And I think that with the Warren Commission, it's a very interesting story and one that we didn't go into in depth, but I do think that there was a significant amount of pressure from Lyndon Johnson to move on with this story, not to get bogged down in a possibility of a conspiracy theory that pointed to, he implied, to Castro, and which would require, obviously, a war with Cuba. So I think that the Warren Commission is shown in the film acting in a way as if to reassure the American public that one assassin did it and not to really examine the evidence. I think that most of the Warren Commission, the 26 volumes that Mr. Garrison read, said that most of the witnesses in it are irrelevant. They have no information. And it just seems like a lot of it is stuffing. I don't think Mr. Warren wanted the job, and we have clear documentation that Mr. Johnson persuaded him strongly to take it. And obviously, as you know, the Warren Commission did not have key information, was not given to it by either the FBI or the CIA. They gave what they wanted to the Warren Commission. And Mr. Dulles, being on the Warren Commission, obviously knew, among other things, of the plots against Castro, and never mentioned to any of his confreres, as far as we know, the possibility that our own intelligence agency was involved in an assassination of a foreign leader, which obviously would have heavily influenced the thinking of the Warren Commission in another direction. If you can destabilize a foreign country, then why the hell can't you destabilize your own country?
Do you think the opening of the files will really prove anything? Won't all the material be missing?
In answer to the previous question on Lifton, a few frames are missing from the film because of a, quote, handling mishap, unquote. But the central point is that the shot is from the front that we make in the movie. So if they were going to tamper with the film, why wouldn't they tamper with that? As it stands, the film is very damaging. And I think the tampering question is less important. I think that the files at the House Select Assassinations Committee are fascinating. There's a number of people that have been interviewed, and if there are no exemptions made and we can see those files, I think it will be. We have some of the 201 file on Oswald. Some of it's still with the CIA. We have Santos Traficante, Richard Case Nagel, William Sullivan, number 3 man in the FBI. He was a director, I believe, of covert operations in '63. Sullivan was interviewed before his suicide. He was killed in a hunting accident by somebody thought he was a deer and shot him on his front lawn. Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana obviously did not get to testify. We have Atlee Phillips, the CIA man. We have Delphine Roberts, who was the secretary to Guy Bannister, Marina Oswald, Wally Weston, impresario, comic in the Jack Ruby Carousel Club. George de Mohrenschildt is there. Dean Andrews, who was played by John Candy in the film, is in that file. William Walter, the FBI guy who found the telex. The Dallas doctors, the Bethesda doctors. We have the 43 hours of Cuban exiles. We have Frank Sturgis. We have Joe Milletier. The JFK hearings, whatever that means, they say JFK hearings, 47 hours. This is stuff that's classified, that's still under file. We would like to see it. Even if this comes out, there is still the issue of what the CIA has, and no one really knows what they have. I think Jim Lazar and Gus Russo of the National Archives, under the Freedom of Information Act, have found out that they could not get any of the files because the CIA said, we have 300,000 pages, we can't Xerox it and give it to you. So that's all we know is there's 300,000 pages at one point was with the CIA. Mr. Tannenbaum, who was a counsel to the committee, the House committee, said that there were 850 boxes and a bunch of film and audio. Beyond that, beyond the CIA, and very few people ever point to it, is that the military intelligence files have never come to the surface. The Army Intelligence Group claimed in 1973 that those files were, quote, routinely destroyed, although we know that Harvey Lee Oswald was on a file. I suggest that they unroutinely find them. ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, those files, we don't know where they are. We have a strong belief that Oswald was involved with ONI. FBI files on Guy Bannister. The moment Guy Bannister died in New Orleans, the FBI came and took his files. Where are they? So it is filtered all over this government. And obviously, this is where the people play a role, and if democracy works, then the president, whoever he be, should be responsive to the desire of the American people to be at one with their own history. But as Norman Mailer said very wittily in his Vanity Fair speech, he thinks that even if we could get into some of these files, it's a bit like leaving a Mercedes in the South Bronx for 20 years. You know, what's left? And John has written me a note here that there are still some Vietnam files that are classified and extremely important.
What is your reaction today to reports today that reputed mobster Carlos Marcello and other alleged mafia members aligned with Jimmy Hoffa in the assassination?
I tried to talk to Carlos in New Orleans. I got as far as his brother, who denied everything. I would love to talk to Carlos. He's 94 years old, and maybe somebody in our government or one of you journalists could go and talk to him. However, I stand by what the film says about the Mafia, that we certainly know now that the Mafia worked with the CIA and was used by the CIA. We have documents that show the CIA used crime elements in various countries to do some of its work. They work hand in hand, as discussed in several scenes in the movie. But Mr. Garrison in the film says it is just inconceivable to him that the Mafia would have the organizational ability to bring an Oswald in and out of Russia, to get him a job in a book depository, to design the parade route or motorcade in such a way that it would bring Mr. Kennedy beneath the building in such a way. And beyond that, how would the mob cover up the autopsy and appoint the Warren Commission?
Your depiction of Garrison as Robin Hood is grossly distorted. Clay Shaw was acquitted in less than an hour, a fact you conveniently ignore. Garrison was using Shaw as a clay pigeon. He wanted to be governor and was using Shaw to gain fame. Please comment.
Why anyone would, in 1967, seek to be a governor of a state by going against it, the CIA and the entire government suggesting they killed its president is beyond me. Your political life, Jim's political life was over the moment he brought those charges. Obviously, he was taking on the establishment in a major way, and he paid a heavy price for it. As to the case itself, I just would want to remind you that he has been vilified and trashed over and over and over again in the press. He has now become a non-person in a sense that Stalin's opponents, Bukharov and Trotsky, became non-persons. There are no specifics that are ever brought up. It's been a media mantra, a buzzword, a coda, a credo. The journalists cite each other to substitute for critical analysis. Jim had an interesting history. He was an FBI man. He was a war hero. He was elected 3 times DA of New Orleans. Why? Not by the establishment, but because he was popular. He was unpopular in the press, in the Times-Picayune. He was unpopular with Clay Shaw's friends. He was unpopular with the establishment of New Orleans. But he was elected 3 times. And then he's since become an appellate judge in that same city after the trial. He had a case. There were 2 evidentiary hearings. He went to a 3-judge panel, criminal judges. He presented his facts. Those 3 judges in 1967 said, go to trial. He went to a grand jury of 12 jurors. They said, go to trial. It was hardly the frolic described, and it was not a whim. He had witnesses and he had evidence. 3 major witnesses, however, died before he could get to trial. Obviously Oswald, obviously Ruby is part of it, but we have Guy Bannister and we have David Ferrie. These were key witnesses in the possible connection of Shaw, Bannister, and Ferrie. We have, since the trial, found significant evidence that Shaw knew Oswald, not only through Perry Russo, but through the Clinton witnesses from Clinton, Louisiana. 10 people, 8 of them black, I believe, pointed to Shaw as being in Clinton that day with Lee Oswald at a CORE rally. Dean Andrews pointed to Clay Shaw, or pointed to a man called Clay Bertrand, who Jim found out to be Clay Shaw. That testimony was thrown out of court by the judge in the scene that we show in the movie with the officer not being allowed to testify. We do believe that Clay Shaw was Clay Bertrand. The jury came back and said that there was no, that Shaw was not guilty, but they all, when they were polled after the trial, they said that Jim Garrison had convinced them that there had been a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, but they couldn't make the link to Clay Shaw. By the way, Jim Garrison did make his summation speech. Several people have said he did not. He did make that summation speech, and 80% of it is in the movie, in the scene. We added some from his Playboy interview and a couple of little polishes from me, but essentially that is his speech and that is his summation. Judge Haggerty, who presided over the case and who in a sense hurt Jim's case by refusing to take the Clay Bertrand testimony, said after Clay Shaw died, he waited until Clay Shaw died in '73, he said in a television interview, "I do believe to this day that the jury should have found Clay Shaw guilty. I do not believe Clay Shaw told the truth on at the trial." After the trial, we come in possession of a picture that shows that Clay Shaw and David Ferrie were at a party together. I think that Shaw perjured himself time and again at that trial, denying that he knew Oswald, denying that he knew Ferrie, and denying that he was a member of the CIA, which we find out that he was. Call him what you want, domestic contact, etc., etc. He has a history with the CIA. It was pointed out by Richard Helms. Finally, under oath, he told the truth. Victor Marchetti supports that theory, saying that during the trial, Mr. Helms was very concerned with the fate of Clay Shaw and offered all the help he could. In addition to that, we now know that Mr. Shaw was on the board of directors of Permindex, a fascist organization in Italy that was thrown out of Italy for illegal espionage activities. Among them, promoting financial transactions in the attempted assassination of Charles de Gaulle, the President of France. So I do not think we have here this innocent businessman pictured by the press. I think we have a serious case that was brought and lost and failed, and that is as it is. But there is something more than meets the eye. I would liken Jim Garrison's case somewhat to the Lawrence Walsh case of the 1980s, when he tried to bring that same covert arm of the government to the light of day, and he failed. Jim's subpoenas on Dulles, on Cabell, on Helms were all squashed by the Justice Department in Washington, and 4 witnesses were not returned to New Orleans by the 4 governors of 4 different states. Why? It's the first time it ever happened to Jim.
Did you at any point have reason to doubt the integrity of the Garrison book? Weren't you warned before you started filming by a reputable JFK researcher that you couldn't believe what Garrison said and that you would be misleading the country all over again if you made a hero out of him?
Well, I believe I answered that same question, that I obviously had heard all the horror stories on Jim, and we investigated everything, and we cannot come up with any of these charges. We heard one charge with Anthony Lewis of the New York Times said that he bribed witnesses. Well, this is the civil libertarian charging this, and we checked it out, and there's no evidence of a bribe. The 2 witnesses that supposedly were bribed said so on television, and when Jim brought a subpoena against them, they refused to sign and to admit to repeat what they said on television. So, you know, show us the evidence. Give Jim the same benefit of the doubt that Clay Shaw has, or I think that we've been treating Jim with a double standard. We've been treating Jim like Lee Harvey Oswald.
Why didn't the Kennedy family insist on a new investigation in light of the Garrison evidence?
According to Frank Mankiewicz, Mr. Robert Kennedy was stunned and in shock. His power was immediately, I think, cut off in a sense because the Warren Commission was appointed by Mr. Johnson, and they took over the investigation. I don't think that Robert Kennedy was even thinking about that at that time. And then 5 months later, he was removed or left office, and another Attorney General came in, Ramsey Clark. I think it was. Correct me if I'm wrong. It is interesting to note, and Mr. Mankiewicz has confirmed it, that several weeks before his death, Robert Kennedy, when asked at a college in Southern California, would he reopen the investigation into his brother's death if he were elected president, said yes, he would. As to the rest of the Kennedy family, I've heard nothing from them. I'm sure that it is a subject of great pain to them, and I sympathize with them, but I do think that this is a much larger issue than the Kennedy family issue.
The National Archives claims that the autopsy photos were donated by the Kennedy family and, as such, are excluded under the Freedom of Information Act. Is this correct, and did you do a FOIA request?
Can I go on to the next one? I'm going to run this by the researcher.
Your art has a point of view and a message. How is it different from propaganda?
I think that's a good question. And I don't quite have the answer to it. I have always said that this film is a hypothesis. It is a combination of fact, as far as we know them, and speculation. And I have, as I've pointed out in numerous interviews and in an article in Premiere Magazine, I have pointed out where we have made composites and taken dramatic license.
Did you mean to imply in JFK that the U.S. government might be implicated in the assassinations of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy?
Yes.
Why are you so fixated on the 60s?
No, the better question is, what did you think of the Saturday Night Live skit? I thought he was better. He should be up here, that actor. I'm fixated on the 60s. I'm not. I've done 3 movies about the 80s, Wall Street, Salvador, and Talk Radio. I do think that the 60s is a seminal decade. It was the seed of what is coming to bear now in the 90s and the 2000s, is that this next generation of leadership, whether it be Dan Quayle or whichever Democratic president, is all in this age group, and we all grew up in the 60s, and our attitudes, our thinking were shaped by the 60s. So, as I said in my speech, I do think that Vietnam is the watershed event of our time, and rather than be fixated on it, I think I've tried to move beyond it. And it's interesting that when I started the Kennedy movie, I never even saw the linkages until Garrison started to talk about him, Newman and Prouty, and then I said, my God, I'm back to Vietnam here.
What did you hope to achieve by excluding certain members of the press from the press screening of JFK?
Which one, Novak and Evans? Is that Frank Mankiewicz's doing? I don't know. Is that the Washington one we're talking about? Or
Didn't specify.
I believe we screened the movie pretty widely. And our problem, of course, was time. We just finished about 7 or 8 days before our release. We were up against the wall. I'm sorry if certain people were left out, except for Mr. Novak or Mr. Evans. In answer to the earlier questions, the photos are excluded from the Freedom of Information Act, but the family gave them to the archives under the condition that serious medical researchers be allowed access. We did not file a FOIA. We obtained negatives from a researcher who inherited them from a Secret Service agent. The FOIAs do take years.
Before asking the last question, we'd like to thank you for being here, have a certificate of appreciation, and a National Press Club paperweight.
Great.
And the last question, you've taken on some of the most powerful institutions in America. When are you about to take on the press?
Starring Dan Rather. I think that's a great subject, and I think that, my God, it's showing us as we really are, thin-skinned, opinionated, hard-drinking scribes. I think the press has taken on me, but whether I can take on the press is obviously something I would know being doomed in advance to bad reviews. I would have to think twice, but I do think it's a great subject, and possibly I will. Thank you. Thank you.